Mechanic asked the disabled veteran about his call sign, Highwater Hank. Made him drop his drink. The old man didn't flinch. While everyone else froze, he just sat there, calm, steady, with years of silence behind his eyes. Across the table, the young mechanic's smile disappeared, replaced by something between shock and respect. It wasn't just a name he'd heard. It was a legend whispered in small towns and old service stories. In that quiet church hall, pride met humility, and a whole room learned the meaning of honor. If you believe some heroes never stop serving, tap the like button, leave a comment for our veterans, and subscribe to keep these stories alive. But to understand how we got to this moment, we have to go back to where it all began. The thunder rolled over Prairie Ridge like a slow drum, steady and patient, testing the old church windows with every distant boom. Fluorescent lights hummed above folding tables where paper plates and crumpled napkins told the story of a fundraiser that ran long. Rain pinned itself to the glass in bright beads, then smeared into silver threads whenever the wind pressed hard. Mud traced dark crescents by the entryway, a trail left by boots that would not fully dry tonight. Somewhere near the kitchen door, a coffee maker gurgled its last breath, then settled into a calming, familiar silence. The fellowship hall smelled like wet wool, black coffee, and the sweet edge of sheet cake thawing on foam plates. Laughter traveled in brief, brave bursts, as if people were testing whether the storm would answer back. Shadows pooled beneath the folding chairs stacked along the wall, tall silhouettes that shifted when lightning flashed. The metal legs of tables screeched across linoleum as volunteers cleared space in practiced patient motions. Every scrape and step echoed longer than it should, as though the room itself was waiting to hear its name. At the far wall, the flag hung still, its reds deeper in the dim, and its stars pale as frost under strip lights. Pinned beneath it, a corkboard showed picnics, baptisms, softball teams, and harvest parades, all smiling into old summers. A snapshot of a flooded street, water like a river over asphalt, curled slightly at one corner where the tack had loosened. Someone had written Black Willow Never Forget in neat blue ink below that weathered photograph. No one had noticed the tack slipping, or the way the edge of the memory had begun to lift from the board. Pastor Elaine gathered foil pans into careful stacks, her silver hair catching the occasional streak of lightning and glowing for a breath. She moved like someone who knew the hall better than her own living room, reading its moods like scripture. Her hands paused whenever thunder leaned in close, as if listening for more than weather on the other side. A silent prayer threaded through her work, the kind practiced in storms of all kinds and times. She glanced toward the corner table, then returned to stacking, her face calm but alert in a seasoned way. By the service window, Ray Bowman wiped the counter with slow circles, the rag warm and damp in his hand. He had poured coffee at every gathering this town could remember, always steady, always here before the first car and after the last. Tonight his eyes kept drifting to the bulletin board, then to the corner where a man sat quiet as a kept promise. A weight he could not name rested on his shoulders, as heavy as a wet coat no peg would hold. He worked the rag in another circle and told himself he was only cleaning, nothing more. In that corner, Hank Mercer sat in his wheelchair with a thermos and a plain cap, his posture measured and still. He had the look of someone who could grow smaller without shrinking, at home in clear air and in crowded silence. The cap's gold stitching was faded but true, the letters honest as work done without witnesses. His hands were strong in a way that did not ask anyone to notice, veins raised like river lines on a county map. He watched the flag with an expression that was not quite sadness and not quite rest. Near the double doors, younger volunteers built towers of chairs and traded jabs that grew sharper with each round. Their jokes floated at first like dandelion fluff, then collected weight as they bounced off the walls. Phone screens lit their faces in cold rectangles, every laugh brighter than the one before it. They were good kids, locals said, but their youth had the loudness that comes before life teaches tone. They meant no harm until they did, and even then they might not know where the harm began. Lightning turned the stained glass into panels of pale blue, lavender, and washed out gold for a beat, then let go. In that flash, every wrinkle and worry across the room stood up like raised letters you could read with your fingers. When the light eased, conversation softened, and the hall took a long shared breath without deciding to. The storm pressed a broad palm against the roof, and the building answered with a tired little shiver. Some truths prefer a night like this, when the brave thing is simply to remain and listen. The wind found the gap beneath the east door and slid in with a cool draft that lifted a scatter of flyers. One fluttered toward Hank's table, a church bake sale notice with smeared ink and a crook staple scar. He caught it with a practiced hand and smoothed it flat, the gesture gentle as returning a photograph to its frame. A small sound escaped Ray, not a word, more like a step taken in memory instead of on the floor. The storm raised its voice again, and people looked at one another as if deciding who would speak first. Someone switched the hall to half lights, and the space grew narrower, nearer, and more intimate. The stack of chairs became darker spires, and the photos on the corkboard felt warmer somehow. A child's laughter from a side room ran up the wall and vanished toward the ceiling like a firefly. Hank's thermos ticked softly as the metal adjusted to the room's shifting temperature. The night settled lower across the town, and the church settled into the night. A final pan clanged into place, and the sound rang longer than the metal should have allowed. Pastor Elaine set both palms on the counter and looked around as though counting souls, not people. Ray wrung out the rag and folded it once, then again, his jaw working without words. By the door, the younger men quieted just enough to hear themselves better, which made their voices feel larger. The storm did not move off, and the room decided not to either. Hank Mercer sat beneath the bulletin board as if the wall itself had chosen him for witness. The soft creak of his chair blended with the ceiling's low electric hum, a quiet duet that kept time with the rain. He poured an inch of coffee into a foam cup and watched the steam climb in a thin, steadfast thread. His reflection hovered in the window for a heartbeat whenever lightning rinsed the glass clean. A man could disappear in a good town without ever leaving it, he thought, and sometimes that was a choice. He studied the photographs pinned overhead, faces set in summers that had already forgiven their heat. A softball team in dusty uniforms grinned beside a truck bed piled with orange coolers and dusty gloves. A 4th of July parade showed a flag arched proud above Main Street, all the storefronts wearing their best. Hands clasped over baptism water, eyes closed against the glare of mercy and the bright afternoon. A snapshot of a flooded block, water brown and high, the hand-lettered note beneath like a whispered vow. Hank's hands were mapped by years, the knuckles squared, the nails tidy, the veins standing like braided cord. He wrapped both palms around the cup and let the heat sit in his bones, where it could do some small good. The cap on the table was an ordinary thing that certain people could read like a book and others could not. He did not move to make it more visible, and he did not move to hide it. He let it be a true thing in plain sight. Outside, the storm rearranged itself, and the roof answered with a small, old house sound. Across the hall, Ray Bowman polished a clean counter, as though a finish line lay just beyond the shine. He did not look over, and did not have to. Knowledge can sit in the neck and shoulder and still be heavy. The distance between them was shorter than the aisle, but longer than a stubborn year. A friendship can survive in a jar like preserve, sweet and sealed and waiting for someone to open it. Ray rinsed the rag again, then set it down, then picked it up, as if forgetting were a task he could complete. Pastor Elaine crossed the room with the natural authority of someone who picks up things and puts them back right. "Coffee holding out, Hank?" she asked, her voice a warm quilt in a cold draft. He offered a small smile that showed gratitude without inviting attention to sit down and stay. "Enough to outlast the rain," he said. And the rain, hearing its name, struck the glass in polite disagreement. She studied him for a quiet second, then nodded as though they had finished a longer conversation. "Folks will be grateful you came," she added, not for noise but for the weight it carried. He looked at the bulletin board instead of her, where faces remembered him better than people did. "Folks are good," he said, and meant it, because truth should not be punished for what memory forgets. "Storms make people kinder or louder, sometimes both," she answered, and folded her hands the way pastors do. "Either way, they pass," he said, and something like tiredness and hope took turns in his voice. The young men by the door were taller in the low light, their jackets dark on the backs of chair stacks. One balanced a tower a little too proudly, and his friends laughed because the balance held. Their talk rolled along the top of the room, harmless enough until a word found the wrong ear. Phones slid back into pockets, and that small surrender made them louder in a different way. Hank sipped his coffee and returned the cup to the table as if setting down a thought he would not chase. The wind shifted, and the church let out a long, thin groan that sounded older than the brick could be. Somewhere, a door latch clicked, then held, a little report of faithfulness doing its plain job. A stack of aluminum pans chimed softly as the building settled, a silver choir practicing without a congregation. The lights flickered once and resumed, steady, resolute, unwilling to dramatize what the weather was already doing well. Hank watched the ceiling a moment, then let his gaze drift back to the flag that still had not moved. The hall had grown smaller, or nearer, or both. The edges felt closer, and even the air seemed to take up less room. A child's sneakers squeaked down the corridor and vanished around the corner, joy making no apology for itself. Two older men discussed wiper blades and fence posts in voices that never learned to shout. The weather organized itself into sheets and pauses, a disciplined cadence that soldiers would respect. Hank traced the cup rim with his thumb, a small circle like a patrol he knew by heart. He did not ask to be recognized, but recognition sometimes arrives without an invitation if the door is left on the latch. He had given certain things away on nights that did not become parades, and the ledger suited him as it stood. Still, there was a picture of a flooded street on the board above his shoulder that made the air feel heavier. He could smell wet gravel in the memory, and hear an engine testing stubborn water, and see porch lights shivering. He blinked once and let the present return, faithful as a dog that never left the yard. Across the room, a laugh landed too hard and skidded, leaving a mark where it did not belong. It wasn't cruel yet, only careless, the kind that grows in a group like weeds after a warm rain. Hank set his cup down and lifted his eyes, not quickly, not slow, with the calm of a man who has paid his dues. Ray's hands froze on the counter, and Pastor Elaine turned slightly, as if hearing a hymn change keys mid-verse. The storm pressed its palm to the roof again, and the fellowship hall waited to see who would speak first. Kyle Briggs stacked the last chairs like a skyline and dusted his palms, pleased with the view he had built. Rain hammered the glass, and the thunder felt like applause to a man who liked the sound of himself. He was a reservist and a mechanic, proud of both, sleeves shoved to the elbow, grease ghosts on his knuckles. A foam glow lit his grin while a buddy read a joke about soft duty and hard work out loud. The laughter that followed was big enough to fill the hall, big enough to forget what room they were in. He noticed the cap on the corner table the way a young coyote notices a porch light, curious, bold, not wise yet. The letters meant something, he knew, but meaning comes in layers, and he had only peeled the first. "Man, that hat's older than the truck I'm fixing tomorrow," he said, not cruel, just careless with the match. His friends chuckled and looked back and forth, boys testing the ice with both feet at once. Somewhere behind them, Ray's rag stopped moving, and Pastor Elaine's shoulders slowed. Kyle fed off the silence the way some men feed off a crowd, mistaking quiet for permission granted. He strolled a few steps closer, balancing the chair on one palm as if strength were the point at hand. "Hey, sir," he called, voice light as a bottle cap flicked across a counter, bright with youthful bravado. "You rocking the discounts, or did you do the duty?" he asked, a smile hitching on one corner too high. The words landed with a soft thud that made the room feel smaller and the storm feel louder. A few of the older folks looked at their shoes, which is another way to say they were looking back in time. One woman tightened her cardigan and the line of her mouth, as if bracing for weather that had changed direction. The flag did not move, but the air beneath it changed shape as air does when a furnace kicks on. Ray opened his hand and let the rag drop to the counter, where it lay like a surrender flag no one raised. Somebody near the kitchen coughed and then didn't again, the noise too sharp for the quiet it crossed. Kyle kept smiling because momentum is a thing you notice only when it fails you mid-step. He tapped the chair leg against his shoulder and waited for an answer he expected to tease. A friend muttered, "Come on, man," the kind of warning that arrives 2 beats too late. But 2 beats are long enough for doors to open, and the wrong ones swing wide when pride's in charge. Lightning flashed, caught in the window glass, and framed the whole room as if for a photograph. The older men by the coat rack shifted their weight, boots grinding grit into the floor with a careful rhythm. One of them almost spoke, then let the sentence sit back down where it had stood up from. Pastor Elaine stepped forward, palms loose, chin steady, the peacemaker's walk learned in living rooms and sanctuaries. Her eyes moved between the cap, the boy, and the man beneath the bulletin board without blinking. Nothing in her face was loud, but everything in her bearing asked for measure, for weight, for care. Kyle never meant to be a villain. He was the sum of good work, good intentions, and an untested tongue. He had learned respect in pieces, not yet assembled into a thing that could steer him mid-laugh. The storm outside cheered him on with wild knuckles on the roof, a soundtrack too easy to mistake for bravado. He looked around and saw attention, which he thought was a kind of victory, and mistook it for approval. He tipped his chin, ready with another line, the arrow already on the string before the target deserved it. Ray said the boy's name, Kyle, the way a father might, and a shadow of apology passed over the floor. Kyle heard it, but pretended not to, because retreat is a hard tune for pride to carry on a first verse. He looked back at Hank and decided to perform, as if the old man were a mirror for his own reflection. "Discounts or duty," he repeated, softer, nudging the moment as if it would budge toward laughter again. The moment did not move. It braced itself and waited for the only answer it would accept. Hank's hand closed around his cup and then released it, a small tide rolling in and out at the shoreline. He did not look at the cap, because the cap did not need his help to be what it was. He lifted his eyes with the quiet of a bell you hear before you know it has been rung. His face was untroubled, the way the face of a man can be when he has been to the end of trouble and come back. He breathed once, slow, as if to make room for the next sentence to arrive in good order. The church seemed to lean toward him, and the rain seemed to step back one pace to listen. Even the chair towers steadied, as though weight and balance had decided to behave for a holy minute. Kyle's smile loosened, confused by the sudden gravity that had entered the hall without a sound. The past had slipped its key into the present and turned the lock, and the door eased open on oiled hinges. Hank Mercer, who did not ask to be known, made the room ready to know him. Hank set both palms on the table as if blessing it, and then lifted his chin toward the boy. The hall caught its breath, the way a field does when the wind pauses between tall grass and tall silence. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to, because truth has its own volume when spoken clean. The cup steamed, the flag hung still, and the storm pressed its ear to the roof to hear. "Highwater Hank," he said, 2 words placed carefully where care had been missing. The syllables landed like a stone in a well, dropping through years, touching cold rings of memory. A woman near the bulletin board closed her eyes, and her hand found the edge of a photo without looking. One of the older men said, "Lord," not as a swear, but as a prayer returning to a mouth that remembered it. The chair Kyle balanced found the floor unsteadily, metal feet arguing with linoleum before they agreed to stand. Ray breathed out through his nose like a runner crossing the line he should have crossed earlier. Kyle blinked because the name meant more to the room than it did to him, which is another kind of education. He glanced from face to face and read a story he had not been assigned to read until this exact minute. Highwater, he repeated under his breath, as if tasting the word might teach him the thing it carried. The letters gathered weight as they moved through him, the way a creek gathers force winding toward a river. His shoulders came down a fraction, like a flag easing from a gust back to its long, patient poise. Pastor Elaine stepped closer to Hank's table, not to shield him, but to stand correctly in the presence of truth. Her eyes shone, not with tears yet, but with the polished look of reverence that comes from seeing justice enter a room. She did not speak, because sometimes a pastor's job is to let the silence preach before any sermon tries. Her hands folded and unfolded once, a small liturgy learned in hospital corridors and kitchen chairs. "Thank you," she whispered, "to the name, to the night, to the courage it takes to say a thing just right." Ray left the counter because the counter did not need him anymore, and his friend did. He walked around the table stacks like a man moving through a river he used to know. When he reached the corner, he stopped, hands empty, mouth unsure, heart loud. "Hank," he said, and the name came out with sawdust and apology caught in it. Hank glanced up, and the look was steady enough to hold two men and a storm at once. Lightning flared and went quiet, and in that breath, the room decided who it wanted to be. The young men stood straighter, because youth knows when to imitate virtue while it learns the real thing. Kyle swallowed, the sound bright in his own ears, and took one step nearer to the table. No one moved to block him, because the lesson was not a gate, but a road that could be walked. The rain softened and gathered itself again, the way a choir breathes between verses. Hank turned one wheel a few inches, angling himself so the whole room could see without spectacle. He did not tell the story. He did not need to, not yet, because the name had already done half the work. Names are doors, and this one opened onto a night when water climbed where it should not dare. He let the name hang, a lantern on a nail, throwing light over faces that finally remembered where they were. In that light, pride looked smaller, and honor looked exactly the size it had always been. Kyle rubbed his palms together, as if warmth could be made from friction when humility was the heat he needed. "I didn't know," he said, voice thin as thread, which is how a bridge begins before it learns to carry weight. Hank nodded, not absolving, not condemning, just marking the truth as accounted for. "Most don't," he answered, the words clean as rain on gravel, washing dust without washing anything away. The answer did not close the matter. It opened a space where a better thing could stand. Somewhere in the hall, a breaker ticked, and the lights settled even steadier than before. The storm shifted its shoulders and pressed against the far wall instead of the roof. Photographs on the board seemed to uncurl, as if the paper itself were listening for a name it recognized. "Highwater Hank," someone repeated softly, a citizen recording the minutes of a meeting into memory. The room became a witness box without the sting, and every person took an oath without raising a hand. Pastor Elaine looked at Kyle, then at Ray, then at Hank, and finally at the flag. She did not scold and did not soothe. She let the order of things correct itself in front of everyone. "Let's make room," she said, and the crowd adjusted, a gentle choreography of neighbors relearning respect. In that small shift, the town's posture changed, and posture is where repentance begins when it is honest. No one left, because nobody leaves when weather turns and truth arrives at the same time. Hank lifted his cup, finished the last of the coffee, and set the foam down with a soft round sound. He rested his hands on the rims of his wheels, palms easy, ready to move without hurry. The hall waited, not for spectacle, but for the simple next step that fate asks from steady men. He nodded toward the doors, and the doors, good, old, obedient doors, offered the way into the rain. Between one heartbeat and the next, the room followed, as a body follows its heart when the call is clear. A hush moved through the fellowship hall like a low wind in corn, quiet but unstoppable, bending conversations without breaking them. Older faces tilted toward one another, eyes widening, as the name rippled from lip to lip with careful reverence. Highwater Hank, someone breathed, and the syllables seemed to find their way into the wood of the tables. A younger volunteer frowned at the bulletin board, as if the photos might rearrange themselves into an explanation. Even the rain on the roof changed rhythm, tapping as if it, too, were counting the years in that name. Near the corkboard, a man in a seed company cap pointed to the flood photo with two fingers that had built fences all his life. "You remember that night?" He asked the woman beside him, and her nod was slow, full of porch lights and sirens. "I remember rowboats in the street and the smell of diesel," she whispered, and her hand found her throat. "Somebody was telling folks where to move trucks and where to cut power so no one died," the man said, softer. "And they called him Highwater," she answered, as if a bell had answered back from the past. The words spread in small circles and then in larger ones, reaching the younger men last and landing heavy when it did. Kyle heard it and looked around, watching expressions settle into a gravity he didn't yet own. He tried to piece together why two words could change a room's posture the way a flag raised can. The cap on the table ceased to be an object and became a mile marker on a road he hadn't walked. His shoulders sagged a fraction, not in defeat, but in the first posture of learning. Ray Bowman felt the whisper pass over him like a tide that had known this shoreline before. He gripped the edge of the counter, fingers blanching, not from anger, but from the squeeze of long-kept guilt. He had been there for the town's memories, pouring coffee at every gathering, yet he had failed to pour this truth. Highwater Hank had been his friend, and Ray had let silence do the talking when talk had been the courage needed. The rag on the counter looked like a letter left unsent for too many years. At Hank's table, Pastor Elaine inclined her head, a pastor's amen expressed in posture, not speech. The corners of her mouth tightened with tenderness that was not pity but respect placed in the right hands. She watched the whisper doing its work, gentle as water yet strong enough to carve stone. There are sermons that come from pulpits, she knew, and sermons that walk in on their own 2 feet. Tonight, the second kind had arrived, and it had picked its text from a town's living history. A boy near the door said, "Is that really him?" And an older neighbor answered, "Son, some things are more real than records." The boy's eyes darted to the flag, then to the wheelchair, then to the rain-streaked windows where reflections layered. Why didn't anyone say? He asked, the question bare as a winter tree, honest in its lack of leaves. "Because the good ones don't ask for it," the neighbor replied, then added, "and the rest of us forget to insist." The boy nodded once, a single seed planted, nothing more and nothing less. Kyle set a chair back onto the stack with both hands, careful now, as if noise itself could bruise. He wanted to unspool his words from the air and wind them back into his chest where they could do no harm. The hall wouldn't give him that miracle, but it allowed him a clear line of sight to the man he'd mocked. Hank's face remained calm, not distant present in a way that asked nothing and offered a lesson anyway. Kyle swallowed and felt the swallow. A sound louder than laughter had been a few minutes before. The storm punctuated the quiet with a crack of thunder that rattled frames and shook crumbs from table edges. A toddler squealed at the noise and then laughed, teaching the room how fear and joy sometimes share a doorway. A mother shushed gently, rocking the child as though calming one small heart might lower the pressure in all the others. The lights dimmed a hair and brightened again, the building doing its steady work as if prayers had wires. In that flicker, faces looked older, then younger, then exactly as they were meant to look, responsible. A line of men by the coat rack began trading names, each memory like a stitch closing a long tear. "Remember the truck that stalled by the grain elevator," one said, "and how the winch line came out of nowhere." Remember the sandbag wall by the clinic, another added. How someone kept the pattern right when panic wanted wrong. They spoke without pointing, but their eyes rested on Hank, full of gratitude that had slept too long. The wind at the east door sighed, as if tired of being the only voice strong enough to move people. Pastor Elaine lifted her hand, not to silence the room, but to gather it into one attentive body. "Friends," she said, and the word worked better than any gavel, "let's keep our respect where it belongs." Her gaze traveled over the younger men, not condemning, but inviting them into a larger story. She turned slightly toward Ray, as if asking him without language to take the next faithful step. Ray nodded once, a man finally answering a call he had heard years earlier and ignored. The whisper made one more circle through the hall and came to rest where it had started, at Hank's table. Hank met it without flourish, steady as a fence post, rooted as a cottonwood in good soil. He neither basked in it nor swatted it away. He let it be what it was, a town remembering itself. His eyes lifted to the flag and then to the door, as if the rain outside might cool what the blood inside had warmed. The room, having learned its first lesson, waited for its second one with a readiness that felt like reverence. Ray stepped out from behind the counter and into the open, the way a man leaves shade when it is time to work. He crossed the hall with a slow, practiced stride that had once matched Hank's beside dusty roads and midnight chow lines. The rag stayed behind like a shed skin, and the smell of coffee gave way to the clean scent of rain through the door seam. When he reached the corner, he did not speak right away, because some words deserve the courtesy of silence first. "Hank," he said finally, and the name carried nails and lumber, a promise to build something back. Hank looked up, a small lift of the chin that said he recognized the voice and all the years riding inside it. Ray's mouth worked, opened, closed, and tried again, the mechanics of repentance not as simple as turning a wrench. "I should have said your name sooner," he managed, eyes bright with a wetness he would not let fall. "I should have said it when the town told it wrong, and when folks forgot it, and when I got tired of insisting." Hank listened, the quiet in him like a clearing where a man can set down what he's carried too far. Kyle took 2 steps nearer and stopped, one hand still on the top chair of the stack as if holding himself in place. He saw the history between the older men not as a wall, but as a bridge where he was not yet allowed to walk. His earlier bravado tasted like metal now, the kind you get when a word snaps down on your tongue. "I didn't know," he said again, softer, and then bit the inside of his cheek to stop himself from making it about himself. The room did not turn to him or away. It kept its eyes on the wound being opened properly at last. Thunder rolled across the roof in a low, continuous line, like someone dragging a heavy trunk down a long hall. The lights flickered twice, and the emergency strips along the baseboards blinked on in a pale corridor glow. Faces sharpened in that emergency light, the kind that makes imperfections honest and virtues plain. The photograph of the flood lifted at the curled corner and then settled back as if someone had pressed it smooth. Pastor Elaine laid a palm on the table and said, "Respect," with so little force it felt like a law instead of a plea. "Let's show it, please," she added, and there was no mistaking that the whole room had just been placed under good authority. The young men straightened, feet apart, shoulders back, instinct finding an older posture it had long admired. Kyle nodded, jaw tight, accepting the shape of the moment without trying to resize it for comfort. A woman guided her children to sit on the first row of stacked chairs, as if saving them a front row seat to decency. Ray exhaled like a man who had just lifted a refrigerator down a staircase and found the landing solid. "You remember Black Willow," Ray said, the words aimed at Hank and also at himself. "I remember your voice on the radio telling people to move the vans and cut the lines and hold the western wall." He swallowed and went on. "Because the body learns how to keep moving through hard ground, or it never leaves the field. And when it came time to write it down, I let someone else hold the pen. And I didn't stand behind you like I should have." Hank's features softened, not with sentiment, but with the grace of a man who sees a truth finally arrive home. The generator thumped and caught, a deep-bellied sound that ran through the floor into the soles of their boots. The overhead lights accepted the relay and came back with a fuller steadiness, bright without being harsh. Hank rotated his chair a few inches, aligning himself with Ray in a way that redrew lines others could follow. "This place needed quiet more than noise back then," Hank said, voice level, "and I was willing to be the quiet." The room absorbed the sentence like dry land taking rain, grateful for what it could not produce on its own. Ray's hand lifted an inch, as if to touch Hank's shoulder, then fell back, because permission matters when repairing old timber. "I let that quiet become erasure," he said, speaking to the fault as if it were a person he could finally face. "I called it humility, but it was fear dressed up in Sunday clothes, and it let the town forget your name." He stood his ground and did not look away, and in that choice there was the seed of a new harvest. Hank nodded once, a carpenter's approval when a beam finally sits right on the post. Kyle stepped forward one more pace, the floor beneath his boots offering no argument to his weight. "I disrespected you," he said, each word placed as carefully as a sandbag on a rising edge. "I treated your hat like a prop because I didn't know how to read a life I hadn't lived." He steadied his breath, keeping his eyes on Hank, not on his friends, not on anyone who might rescue him. Hank met the gaze, not as a judge, but as a man unwilling to lie about what's required for a soul to grow. Pastor Elaine drew a breath that gathered the room and stitched it neatly along its hem. "Truth asks for quiet and then for courage," she said, and the sentence seemed to set the next steps in the right order. "We've had the quiet. Now let's give space for the courage that belongs to what comes next." She looked toward the door, where the rain made a silver curtain that invited passage rather than hiding. "Outside," she added gently, "and we will keep our respect with us as we go." Hank placed both palms on his wheels and prepared to move, the rubber familiar under hands that had pushed through worse. Ray moved to his side, not to lead and not to follow, but to walk true after years of walking almost. Kyle cleared the way, lowering the chair stack as if lowering a voice, making a path without asking credit for it. The town shifted with them, a single body learning again how to step in rhythm with its better self. They turned toward the doors, where the storm waited with clean air and a wide, forgiving space. Pastor Elaine lifted her hand and the hall obeyed without argument, the way wheat bows when the wind asks kindly. Her voice crossed the room with a steady warmth that left no one out and excused no one from decency. "Ray," she said, eyes on the man by Hank's side, "get someone who knows, and let's put this right." The sentence was simple, but it fit the moment like a key turned in a long-stuck lock. Ray nodded once, as if he had been waiting years for a permission this plain to finally arrive. He looked at Hank, then at Kyle, then at the flag, and in that quick triangle something settled inside his chest. The rag he had left on the counter seemed like old silence shed, a thing no longer wearable or needed. He patted the pocket where he kept a battered phone that had numbers memorized by thumb and heart. "Back in a minute," he told Pastor Elaine, and she answered with the quiet strength of a chaplain in a storm. Ray turned toward the doors, and the town made room the way water parts for a boat with purpose. The handles were cool and damp, and the hinges sang a tired hymn as he pulled the double doors wide. Rain hit his face in silver needles that softened to a wet blessing before they could sting. The parking lot shone like a sheet of coal under the lights, every puddle a breathing chest. He stood beneath the awning where the driplin stitched a bright seam along the concrete. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled, not angry anymore, only patient and deep as an oath kept. Ray scrolled past numbers he would not call and stopped on a name he had not pressed in years. "Whitaker," he whispered to himself, and the syllables tugged him back to radios and rough maps. He hesitated, the way a man does before knocking on a door he helped close and should have opened sooner. Then he pressed his thumb, and the line began to ring, each buzz a bridge plank returning underfoot. Behind him, The hall hummed with a respectful quiet that sounded almost like prayer offered in low voices. "Colonel," Ray said when the call caught, his breath clouding in the cool breath of the storm. "Bowman here. Prairie Ridge. I need you to come to the church. Sir Hank Mercer needs you to come." There was a pause that stretched across miles and years, and one unforgiven night of water. Ray filled the pause with what mattered. "It's time to say it, and I should have asked you sooner." On the line, a voice answered low and steady. "I'm on my way. Keep him there. Keep them decent." Ray lowered the phone and let his shoulders fall, as if a beam had finally found a post cut to length. He wiped rain from his brow with the back of his hand and tasted metal and memory together. A pickup rolled by on the road and sent ripples across the nearest puddle, a tiny wake. He thought of the photograph on the corkboard and the way the paper's edge had begun to curl. Some things had been waiting for this exact wind. Some things needed weather to help them lay flat again. When he stepped back inside, the hall felt warmer, closer, gathered with intent instead of accident. Pastor Elaine met his eyes, and he nodded, and that was enough to inform the whole congregation. "Hank," Ray said gently, "he's coming. The man who owes you the truth is on the way." Hank's expression did not change, but the air around him brightened like wood fed a small flame. Kyle drew a quiet breath and stood straighter, as if a standard had been raised and asked for his posture. "Thank you," Pastor Elaine told Ray, voice soft but final, as if dismissing a worry to its proper place. "We keep our respect while we wait," she added, and the phrase settled on shoulders like a good coat. The children were guided to sit, the elders found steady walls to lean against, and the young men folded their arms. No one filled the quiet with nerves or noise. They let the quiet do its clean, necessary work. Ray moved beside Hank, not in front and not behind, as a man stands when he is writing a ledger. Outside, the storm shifted from hard percussion to a softer wash that shined the night instead of scarring it. Ray's phone lay face down on the table, screen dark, but everyone could hear the promise it had carried. Hank folded his hands on the wheel rims and rested them, palms open, steady as a courthouse clock. Pastor Elaine stood like a sentinel between the flag and the door, a keeper of both symbol and passage. Somewhere, a breaker ticked, and the lights held firm, like resolve refusing to blink at the next truth. Time slowed into long, whole breaths measured by the roof's steady drip and the building's old bones. They were not waiting for spectacle. They were making themselves ready for witness given and witness kept. In the stillness, even Kyle could hear the sound a heart makes when it learns a better rhythm. The hall did not feel small anymore. It felt exact, like a room the right size for a promise. Then the east door rattled once in a clean gust, and the town understood the moment was moving toward them. The church doors creaked and swung wide, admitting a blade of rain-silvered night before a figure filled the frame. Colonel Samuel Whitaker stepped through, coat dark with weather, posture straight, eyes clear as if polished by the storm. Water ran off his hat brim in tidy streams and left a map of bright dots across the threshold. He took 2 unhurried steps, the kind that carried decades without demanding attention for the wait. Conversations died mid-syllable, then folded themselves into silence that felt like standing when the anthem starts. He removed his hat with a measured hand and held it against his ribs, not for show, for order. Pastor Elaine inclined her head as one caretaker to another, acknowledging the transfer without words. Ray straightened but did not speak, letting the space form around the man who needed it now. Kyle kept his shoulders back and his mouth closed, learning reverence the way a body learns balance. The door eased shut behind the colonel, with a sound like a book closing on a chapter read aloud well. Whitaker's gaze found Hank without hunting, the way iron finds a magnet and stops wandering. He moved directly toward the corner table, boots leaving a neat trail of raindrops that glowed under fluorescent haze. He halted, not too close, and squared himself with the man who had once steadied a whole town in water. Then he raised his hand in a deliberate salute, wrist straight, fingers crisp, a line drawn clean in humid air. "Hank," he said, voice low but bright. "Highwater Hank," and the name stood at attention with him. The crowd breathed as one, a soft tide against the wall and back, reverence gathering like dew. A woman near the corkboard pressed her fingertips to the flood photograph, as if to anchor the present to the record. Two older men removed their caps by instinct and held them against their chests, eyes fixed on the exchange. A child asked a question with her eyes and received an answer in the shape of her father's stillness. Every person in the hall understood that justice sometimes arrives without a gavel and corrects the minutes anyway. Hank did not return the salute because he was seated and because some honors are accepted, not mirrored. He lifted his chin in acknowledgement, letting dignity wear its plain clothes rather than medals it did not need. The steam rising from his cup had thinned to nothing, but the warmth in the room had thickened. "Colonel," he said, the single word holding history the way a beam holds a roof. Whitaker lowered his hand and kept his eyes on Hank, not on the audience that would have given him their cheer. The colonel glanced once at Ray and gave a nod that held apology and gratitude braided into one rope. Ray returned it like a man who had been thirsty and finally drank from water he should have drawn long ago. "Pastor," Whitaker added, acknowledging the steward who had ordered the room and protected its quiet. Then he faced Hank again, the line between them now a bridge that anyone could see and trust. "I owe you," he said plainly, and the simple admission sounded like the honest start of a long account. He took one half step to the side, so the whole room could see his face without leaning or guessing. "This town never got the full story," he continued, his words trimmed neat of drama or excuse. The storm exhaled against the western wall as if to hush any interruption that might be tempted to rise. "The night of Black Willow, when paper preferred silence, you chose people," he said, not yet telling details, only truth. Around him, posture became attention, and attention became respect, and respect became readiness to listen. Kyle felt the words enter him like clean air after a sprint, burning and good and necessary. He did not move, but something in him did. Some gear he had long kept in neutral slid into a better meshing. He saw the cap on the table not as costume, but as witness sworn in and sworn to. He let the room's reverence write a new line across his pride and did not reach for an eraser. Whatever came next would not star him. It would fix him, and that felt like mercy dressed as instruction. Pastor Elaine let the silence frame Whitaker's next breath, choosing not to rush what did not belong to her. Ray laid his hand flat on the table behind Hank, not touching, present as a brace beneath the grain. A fluorescent fixture ticked and steadied, as if even the lights were setting their shoulders properly. Whitaker's wet coat hem tapped once against his boot, a small metronome for words that would not hurry. He drew breath to speak the first clear thread of the story that would set the town's memory square. Before he began, he placed his hat on the table, brim up, like a bull set out to catch whatever needed keeping. "Highwater Hank," he said again, not for drama, for accuracy, so the name would fix itself in every ear. He let the words linger, bright as a lantern hung on a nail before work is done by its light. Then he looked at the faces, old, young, ashamed, attentive, and to the flag that had not moved all night. "Let's tell it right," he said, and the hall, the storm, the town itself leaned in to receive what was owed. Colonel Whitaker stood with his hat resting brim up on the table, gathering breath the way a careful man gathers facts. His eyes moved once across the room, measuring the distance between memory and record like a carpenter checks a span. "When Black Willow rose," he began, "orders said hold position, wait for assets, keep the grid exactly as written. But the river didn't read the plan, and neither did the wind, and people were already on the wrong side of time. So one voice took charge, plain and steady, and the town followed because the tone told them how to stand." He described headlights pointing into brown water that moved like muscle, alive and stubborn and cold. He named the grain elevator, the clinic wall, the culvert that churned like a throat trying to swallow a truck. He spoke of elders lifted through windows, of kids handed down a sandbag ladder, of generators cut before sparks. Whoever ran that board, he said, called the plays that saved dozens and risked a dozen more to do it right. And when morning came, the water fell back and the ledger rose up, and paper wanted a different hero. Command needed clean lines, he continued. The words trimmed neat of anger, heavy with simple truth. There were violations. Yes, the kind you make when the right thing outruns the written thing by a mile. A younger crew would have worn the blame, and never worked again. Good hands wasted to please a paragraph. So one man stepped forward, signed where the heat would land, and let the noise point at his name instead. And I let that happen, he said, because I knew what he chose, and I owed him the quiet he asked for. The hall listened like a congregation that has waited years for the right scripture to finally be read aloud. Pastor Elaine's fingers rested lightly on a folding chair, knuckles white, tendons drawn like lines on a hymn page. Ray's jaw worked, then settled, as if a beam he had carried crooked found its post and sat square. A mother pressed her child's hand flat against her own, teaching reverence without words, lesson by pulse. The flag did not move, but every eye that turned toward it looked newer, as if polished by rain. Whitaker spoke of the map, grease pencil lines slick with humidity, radio chatter clipped and careful. He told how high water became a calcine whispered between volunteers when a calm voice cut through panic. He said the voice matched the man at the corner table, and the proof was in outcomes, not applause. No medals came, he added, but a town woke up alive that might have slept under water instead. And the report filed what reports file: damage, totals, and the kind of silence that looks tidy on a shelf. He admitted the choice to keep the story small, to let the town believe competence floated down from somewhere official. He said he had told himself it protected careers, preserved calm, prevented a fight nobody had time to referee. But we paid with forgetfulness, he said, and some debts compound in the dark like mold behind a wall. Tonight I am paying interest, he added, voice level, naming the man who carried the risk and wore the blame. He turned fully to Hank. You took the weight we were supposed to share, and I signed the quiet that hid it. Hank held the colonel's gaze the way a steady coast holds the tide. Without struggle, without triumph, with truth. He did not nod for credit, and he did not lower his eyes to spare anyone in the room from their part. The steam from his cup was long gone. Warmth now lived in the faces that finally heard their town's name correctly. Ray's breath came slow and rough, an engine returning to idle after a hard climb it should not have done alone. Kyle stared at Hank's hands, at the slight tremor in a knuckle, at the strength that still sat there like iron. Bureaucracy erased him, Whitaker said, and the word sounded too polite for the violence of forgetting. It made a clean story where a brave one stood, the kind that leaves no fingerprints and invites no thanks. He gestured toward the corkboard photo, its curled corner now smoothed by unseen weather and present resolve. We kept the picture and lost the names, and that is not the way of free people honor their own. So hear me plain. Highwater Hank coordinated the rescue, and we are alive because he would not wait. Silence followed, long enough for thunder to walk the roof and move off toward the wheat fields beyond town. In that quiet, apology and gratitude braided themselves into one rope that everyone could hold. No one clapped, because applause is for shows, and this was something sterner and more sacred than display. A man at the back removed his cap and pressed it to his chest, and others followed, not in a wave but in witness. The hall stood inside the truth, like a shelter finally framed and sheathed against years of wrong weather. Whitaker lowered his head a fraction, not in shame but in recognition of weight honestly named. I owe him, and so do I, Ray said, voice breaking and mending in the same breath, the confession plain. A murmur of assent moved across the room, not loud, entirely human, like wind in prairie grass. Hank's eyes softened, not with relief belongs to crisis, but with rest that belongs to set down burdens. The colonel placed his hat back on the table, brim still up, as if to catch whatever grace might overflow. Kyle could feel the storm that mattered most now. No lightning, no thunder, only the churn under his ribs. Shame had a temperature, he learned. It ran hot first, then cooled into something workable if a man let it. He took a breath that tasted of coffee, wet wool, and the dust of folded chairs, ordinary things grown holy by truth. His friends were quiet behind him, as if the lesson needed space around it to root and hold. He stepped forward one pace and steadied himself, a young man asking to stand correctly at last. "Hank," he said, and the name fit his mouth better than the joke ever had, honest where clever had failed. "I made light of what I did not understand, and I asked for credit where I had given none. I can't fix the years people forgot you, but I can start with the minute I remember." He swallowed once, the room hearing it. A small bell rung for attention inside his own chest. "I'm sorry, sir," he finished, not tacked on or shy, but full weight set down where it belonged. Hank studied him the way a craftsman studies a board, checking grain, warp, and willingness to take a true line. He did not rush to speak, because a quick answer can rob a good apology of the work it came to do. His hands rested on the wheel rims, fingers relaxed, a posture that signaled strength without threat. When he spoke, his voice was level as a plumb line and warm as a shop light on a winter afternoon. "I didn't come here for honor," he said. "I came for coffee, and because this town is still mine." He let the truth sit with them, then added what only a certain kind of man can add without pride. "I never wanted a headline," he said. "Just peace enough to buy groceries and nod at my neighbors in the aisle. But peace isn't the same as erasure, and I'm grateful you all can tell the difference now." He looked at Kyle, not past him, not around him, meeting the boy where the boy had asked to be met. "You'll do fine," Hank said. "Just stand straight when it's time, and bend when it isn't. Learn the difference early." A sigh moved through the crowd, relief braided to responsibility, each strand tightening the other. Pastor Elaine's shoulders eased, and the small smile she allowed was not triumph. It was gratitude finding its voice. She glanced toward the flag and then back to the people, as if checking that symbol and citizens agreed. Ray wiped his eye with the heel of his hand and then laughed once softly at himself, unashamed of the water. Colonel Whitaker's posture shifted from witness to neighbor, formal edges softening without losing a stitch of respect. An older farmer cleared his throat and spoke for the shy men who nod more than they talk. "We've been poor stewards of our stories," he said, "and that's on us. Not on him. On us." His wife touched his sleeve, proud of the sentence, prouder of the accountability it carried. Around the room, people nodded, and the nods added up to something that town can build with. No vote was taken, but the decision felt unanimous. The ledger would be corrected where it lived here. Hank's eyes drifted to the bulletin board, to the flood photo, to the blank spaces where new pictures could hang. "If you want to remember," he said, "do it with your lives more than your frames. Keep the generator maintained. Stock the sandbags. Teach the kids to ask better questions than I did. And when the water rises again, and it will choose people first and paperwork second." He let the words land without flourish. Instruction wears best when stitched in plain thread. Kyle straightened at that, as if a draft card for manhood had been slid across the table with his name on it. "I'll be there," he said, not as a promise that needs cheering, but as a plan a man means to keep. Ray added, "Me too," and this time his voice carried no dust, only the clean grain of seasoned wood. Whitaker nodded once, the gesture a vow to show up where he had once stepped back too far. Pastor Elaine finished the chorus softly. "All of us," she said, and the room believed her down to the studs. Hank glanced toward the door where the rain had softened from drumming to a steady gloss on the pavement. "Peace," he said again, half to himself, testing the weight of the word now that it was rightly balanced. He lifted his empty cup and smiled at the ordinary grace of being out of coffee, for reasons that had nothing to do with want. "Let's get some air," he suggested, not commanding, inviting the next right step to arrive in the right way. The town turned with him toward the doors, ready to meet the weather like people who finally remembered how. As they moved, the hall did not empty. It carried its meaning with it, out under the awning where breath steamed. The rain was cool on forearms and warm on faces, a baptism for a memory that had been misnamed and now was not. No one raised a cheer, no one asked for a photo. They let dignity stay clothed in the quiet it deserved. The flag outside tested a small breeze and settled, as if agreeing that calm had finally earned the right to remain. Hank rolled forward, Ray alongside, Kyle a step behind, the colonel and pastor close. The weather inside at last made right. Hank rolled toward the double doors while the hall flowed behind him like a river finally choosing a channel. Ray matched his pace without crowding, one hand ready and idle, the way help waits without insisting. Colonel Whitaker angled to the far side, leaving Hank the clear line that leadership earns without asking. Pastor Elaine moved a step ahead to swing the latch, her palm confident on wood that knew her touch. Kyle followed 3 strides back, quiet, teachable, carrying the weight of a lesson that had just found him. The doors opened to a night washed clean, rain falling in straight, honest lines from a low, generous sky. Sodium lights turned the parking lot into a gleaming sheet where every puddle mirrored the flagpole. The air was colder than the hall, and better for it, a tonic that reached the back of the throat. Thunder had softened to a traveling murmur, like a train beyond the hills reminding folks of distance. A wind moved through the maples by the curb and dropped them back into stillness with a soft clatter. Hank eased down the ramp beneath the awning, tires whispering over the rubber mat with a steady hush. Water speckled his sleeves and collected at the bend of his elbow, beating before it chose a path. Ray stepped where the ramp met the lot, testing the slick surface like a man checking ice on a stock tank. Whitaker's boots struck the concrete with unhurried weight, prints blooming and fading in the same breath. The church behind them breathed through its vents, warm light pooling on the threshold like welcome. Neighbors filled the doorway and the first row of steps, giving the open night the quiet a courthouse deserves. A mother pulled a hood over her little boy's head and pressed his shoulders close without hiding the view. 2 older men removed their caps again, not as habit this time, but as a clean decision remade. The storm laid a soft drum roll on a line of pickup hoods, then eased back to a steady cadence. Somewhere down by the grain elevator, a siren sang once in the distance and then closed its mouth. Hank stopped beneath the awning's edge, where the rain could find his hands and not his lap. He turned the chair slightly so the whole row of faces could see him without leaning or guessing. This was not a stage, and he was not a show. It was ground, level and common, meant for truth. He rested his palms on the rims and let the cold water carry the last heat of anger off them. His breath left him slow, then returned in a steady measure set by weather, not by nerves. Ray stood at his shoulder, chin forward, eyes bright, a man ready to hold whatever needed holding next. Whitaker took a half stride to the side, not to stand above or below, but true alongside. Pastor Elaine anchored the doorway, one hand on the jamb, one hand at her heart, a sentinel for order. Kyle planted his boots on the painted line where 2 parking spaces met, learning where to stand. The town arranged itself like a living psalm petition, confession, witness, and the hope of mercy. Rain ticked against the awning gutter and ran in strands that twisted into a single bright rope. Headlights drifted slowly past on County Road 5, white beams shivering across the wet like fish. The flag at the pole lifted and settled, a small breath drawn and released without speech. Beyond the church lot, the world kept its scale. Fields, fences, a water tower with the town's name. Here, the scale had narrowed to the length of a hand extended and the distance a voice can travel clean. Hank looked at Kyle first, not long, not short, just enough to lay a path between them. He looked at Ray next, and the look carried years across a narrow space and set them down gently. He met the colonel's eyes and saw a creditor who had come to pay, not to collect. He lifted his face into the rain, the way a farmer tastes the weather before deciding the day. Then he nodded once toward the lot, a small signal that the next step would be taken without spectacle. The storm answered with a thicker run of drops, a sound like grain poured into an empty bin. A young woman at the doorway slipped her hand into her husband's and squeezed, then let go again. Some men cleared their throats and found they did not need to speak after all. A child whispered, "She," to no one in particular, and the whole line obeyed the counsel sweetly. The church clock inside struck the quarter, soft through the wall, careful not to interrupt. Hank rolled forward until the front tires just kissed the rain, and he stopped there, meeting its edge. He did not look heroic, and that was his strength. He looked like a neighbor bearing his share. The water freckled his hands and wrote small bright commas on the rubber, pausing and moving on. He let the night see him as he was ordinary, used by grace, unastonished by the cost of choosing people. "All right," he said, almost to the rain, almost to the town, as much to himself as to anyone. Kyle took one careful step off the painted line and another, as if changing aisles in a quiet store. He stopped an arm's length from Hank, boots set square, hands open, chin level, pride put away. The rain touched his hair and drew clean tracks along his temples, proof of an honest moment. He did not rush his mouth. He let his spine decide first, then let his words follow posture. "I was wrong," he said, full voice, no flourish, a beam placed straight onto a waiting post. "I asked a joke to carry a weight that belongs to respect, and it broke where it should have held. I made light of a thing that kept this town from drowning, and I did it to be seen. I did not know, but I could have known sooner if I had lived with my ears open. I'm sorry, sir," he finished, not slipping the words into the rain, but setting them down to stay. His hands stayed still at his sides, palms ready to work, not ready to defend. Hank's shoulders did not lift or fall. They remained where a steady life sets them. He turned the chair a few inches so Kyle no longer stood at the corner of his eye but in front. The rain had cooled his hands enough to make the next gesture crisp and deliberate. He extended one palm in the open air between them, offering a bridge without digging a moat. Kyle stepped in and took it, firm, grateful, the handshake an oath spoken skin to skin. A breath moved through the crowd under the doorway, a release without applause, decent and right. Ray looked down and smiled at his boots, the way a man does when a scene cleans something inside him. Colonel Whitaker shifted his weight and squared his stance, formality relaxing into neighborliness. Pastor Elaine's lips parted in a quiet amen that no one needed to hear to feel. The rain maintained its metronome, tapping time for hearts that had found the correct tempo. Kyle let go, then caught himself, then lifted his right hand and set his fingers true along his brow. It was not theatrical. It was learned, specific, an honor placed where honor belonged. The salute stood in the rain like a fence post set deep enough to outlast weather. He held it until Hank inclined his head, accepting not as prize but as mutual recognition. Then Kyle lowered his hand and stood easier, the new lesson settled where it belongs. Whitaker stepped forward one pace, the water on his coat glittering like filings under a magnet. He brought his hand to his brow and held it, not to outdo the boy, but to stand with him. The line of his arm was clean, old training running through muscle as if no time had passed. Rain tracked from his sleeve to his wrist and did not disturb the steadiness of the angle. When he lowered his salute, his eyes met Hank's and said the rest without sound. Ray did not salute. That was not his uniform. He set his palm flat over his heart and kept it there, fingers spread like a promise. "Forgive me," he said, at a volume meant for one man and a town that shared the air. Hank turned slightly and answered with the faintest smile, the kind that frees and instructs together. "Stand with me," he said, and Ray moved to the shoulder he had left too long. The crowd followed without choreography, neighbors ordering themselves by conscience and good sense. Caps came off. Heads lifted or bowed as each found the right bearing for the hour. No one shouted, no one posed, no one reached for a phone to frame what the heart should keep. They let the rain do the printing, on sleeves, on hair, on the ground where memory would not smudge. It looked like a pledge because it was one, and the words were their faces, quiet and resolved. Hank rested both hands on the rims again and let the moment last until it set like concrete. He did not speak first. He let the town finish telling itself what it wanted to be. Then he gave them the boundary and the gift, plain as a line painted true on a fresh floor. No violence, he said softly, answering a threat that had never been invited and would not be. Apology, work, and witness, that is how we put a name back where it belongs. The wind shifted across the lot, lifting the flag a little higher and letting it fall with dignity. A truck door somewhere clicked shut, and a man hurried past the street in a hat with his collar up. Life continued at its scale while meaning held at its own, neither swallowing the other. Kyle drew a breath that did not burn this time, and nodded once to himself and to Hank. Ray exhaled like a man finished with a long carry, ready now for the building to begin. Colonel Whitaker stepped back into line beside Pastor Elaine, yielding the front to the town it served. The pastor touched the jam with 2 fingers, then lifted her chin as if to bless what weather had blessed. "Let's go inside soon," she said, "and keep this as quiet as it is strong." People answered with movement, not noise, arranging themselves for a return without losing what they had found. Hank looked over the lot, the puddles, the flag, and the faces, and found peace the right size at last. Ray stepped closer until the rain freckled his glasses and blurred the past just enough to handle it. He didn't reach first. He let the silence choose who would move, the way good carpenters let wood speak. Hank angled the chair so they stood face to face, the distance no longer a hallway, but a doorstep. The storm softened its hands on the awning, like a drummer easing the sticks to felt mallets. "Brother," Ray said at last, the word tasting of coffee, sawdust, and the long road back to right. Hank did not make him beg for grace that was already paid for with years of quiet. He raised his hand, palm open, the gesture plain as a porch light left on. Ray took it in both of his rough fingers, wrapping steadiness around steadiness without needing proof. Rain beat it along their knuckles and fell away like coins returned to the rightful owner. Neither man looked away. The past needed to see their eyes open when the ledger changed. "I left you to carry that night alone," Ray said, voice low, not to spare himself but to honor truth. "I called it humility, and it was fear. I called it peace, and it was laziness dressed for Sunday." Hank listened without flinching, his kindness never confusing itself with denial. "You were tired, and I was tired," Hank answered, "and the town needed quiet more than noise. But quiet turned into absence, and absence turned into forgetting, and that's not what neighbors do." Ray laughed once through his nose. Not mockery, only relief finding a door that finally opened. "I can still lift," he said, tapping his chest, "and I'm here to carry the boards I should have carried." He meant boards of memory, duty, and the stubborn work of telling the story right. Hank's mouth shifted, not to a smile exactly, but to something restful and sure. "Then lift from this side," he said, "and we'll keep the weight balanced like it should have been." They didn't hug. The handshake lengthened into a hold that did the same job without spectacle. Colonel Whitaker stood a step back, posture eased, a man satisfied to witness good timber set true. Kyle watched the shape of the moment like a blueprint he meant to study at home. Pastor Elaine bowed her head once, the gentlest benediction, and let the rain finish the blessing. The flag clicked against the pole and settled, a small salute offered by weather and steel. "Tell the truth when folks point at the wrong hero," Hank said, his voice even as leveled gravel. "Stand up before the papers are written, not after, and stand with your back straight." Ray nodded the way men do when instructions are simple, hard, and exactly correct. "I'm done with quiet that erases," he answered, a pledge spoken for more than one man. "From tonight on, I'll be noisy only where it keeps honor from getting misplaced." A younger couple slipped out beneath the awning and stood near the steps, listening carefully. The husband took off his cap without thinking, the brim dripping a thin stream onto his boot. They did not interrupt. They learned by watching how older men repaired a breach. The town felt its spinal line, vertebrae of witness clicking into place one by one. It was not triumph. It was repair, and repair always sounds like relief more than celebration. Ray released Hank's hand and without drama set his palm on Hank's shoulder just once. It landed like the final nail in a plank laid straight, a soft tap that means the board won't wander. Hank touched Ray's wrist, "Thank you," received and returned, then let his hand fall. No one cheered. The quiet held, as if applause would be rude to the work just done. The rain answered for them, drumming a steady approval that needed no words. Kyle shifted a pace nearer, not to intrude, but to take his place correctly among men. "Mr. Mercer," he said, careful, respectful, a student summarizing what he had learned aloud. "Next time the water rises, I'll be there early and leave late, and keep my mouth right." "Good," Hank replied, the single syllable fitting perfectly where a paragraph might have been. "We'll need more hands and fewer explanations when the river decides to talk again." Hank nodded toward the doorway, the warm rectangle of light waiting like a hearth. "Let's go in," he said, voice lighter now that a stone had rolled off a long hill. People shifted in tandem, the town moving as one body without rehearsal. Ray stepped to Hank's side, Whitaker to the other, Kyle falling in 3 steps back. They turned together, carrying an unseen beam between them, the weight finally shared. They crossed from rain to threshold, from the smell of wet gravel to coffee and floor wax. The hall welcomed them as if it had been holding its breath and now could breathe again. Water slid from coats and cuffs and darkened the linoleum in honest maps. The lights looked warmer than before, or perhaps hearts had learned how to see them. Either way, the room felt newly sized to fit the truth it now contained. Pastor Elaine guided people in with a gentle sweep of her hand. No rush, no fuss. "Back to order," she said, but the word meant more than chairs and tables. It meant moral order returned to its hooks, coats where they belong after a storm. Children were seated on the first row of stacked chairs like guests at a long-awaited recital. Even whispers came kinder, as if voices remembered their manners at last. Ray fetched a towel from the kitchen and patted water from Hank's sleeves. Whitaker shook rain from his hat and placed it brim up again beside the cooling urn. Kyle folded a damp floor mat in thirds and set it neatly by the door without being asked. Small tasks found eager hands, and eager hands found the dignity in small tasks. The room practiced the kind of service that makes speeches unnecessary. At the corkboard, the flood photograph had finished uncurling, its edge laying flat. Pastor Elaine slid away a thumbtack and lifted a sun-faded community photo beside it. She reached into a drawer and drew out a fresh print faces from this very night, caught earlier. Neighbors shoulder to shoulder, young beside old, heads uncovered, eyes clear in the storm's glow. "Make room," she said, and the old picture yielded kindly to the present. She pinned the new photo at eye level and smoothed it twice with the back of her hand. It was not a monument. It was a reminder to keep choosing rightly in small rooms. Under it, she wrote with a felt-tip pen, "We remember rightly." The letters were steady, pastor's handwriting that can be read from the back pew. People nodded as if their names had been called during roll and answered, "Here." Ray glanced at Hank and then at the board, the years rearranging inside him. "Been a long time since that space held the truth in full," he said softly. "It'll hold," Hank answered, not bragging, stating what good lumber does when set true. Whitaker added, "I'll see that the report holds too." A soldier's promise made neighbor tight. Kyle looked from pen to photograph to Hank and learned where signatures really matter. Coffee found cups again, but no one refilled loud. The clink of styrofoam sounded careful. A child passed Hank a napkin for the droplets his wheels left. He thanked her by name. Two farmers compared sump pumps in low tones, like men testing fences by moonlight. A teenager asked his mother where sandbags were stored and received a real answer. Useful questions had replaced easy laughter, and the room approved. Pastor Elaine stood where the light fell from the nearest fixture like a blessing. "A town remembers with more than pictures," she said, the sentence brief on purpose. "We remember with posture, with work, with the way we speak to each other." She nodded toward the door, where the rain had quieted to a polished hush. "And when storms come, we return to our places and do the next right thing." Hank let the words pass through him and settle where they should. Deep and calm, peace had not made him larger. It had made the room more accurate around him. He rested his hands on the rims, not because he needed to move, but because readiness suits a man. Ray set a full cup beside his thermos and said nothing. The gesture said enough. Whitaker stood easy, no rank, just neighbor, the kind you want close when lines get tested. Kyle approached the bulletin board and read the caption twice, letting it copy into him. He saw himself in the edge of the new photo, rain-dark hair, shoulders squared at last. He did not smile. He breathed, and the breath felt like a beginning instead of a pose. "Tell them who I chose to be," he whispered, tasting the line that would carry him forward. He looked to Hank, and Hank's nod told him the sentence belonged to more than one man. Chairs were unstacked with care, not haste, feet gliding instead of scraping. The flag hung in the same place it had all night, but now every eye met it without flinching. The clock's minute hand stepped forward, ordinary and holy in the same tick. Outside, the last hard beads of rain gave up their insistence and lay down. Inside, the town stood ready for whatever comes when truth has taken its seat. The rain gentled into a silver hush across the parking lot, a lullaby for engines and tired hearts alike. Inside the fellowship hall, the flag hung steady while warm light smoothed the edges of every chair and face. People found their places without being told, the way a choir returns to pitch after the organ breathes. Hank waited at the front edge of the room, not elevated, only visible, ordinary as good bread. No one asked for a speech, and still the room leaned forward, ready to hold whatever was given. Colonel Whitaker stood a pace off Hank's shoulder, cap brim up beside the coffee urn like a bowl for truth. Ray hovered near the bulletin board, hand resting on the new photo as if guarding a seedbed. Kyle kept to the aisle with his chin set level, learning quiet as a kind of strength worth practicing. Pastor Elaine steadied the room with presence alone, her eyes bright as rain-polished glass. The storm outside signed its name softly along the gutters and settled into listening like the rest. Hank lifted his hands from the rims and folded them, a mechanic setting down tools that have done their work. His eyes traveled across faces he knew by first name, then across faces he knew only by shared streets. "When water came," he said gently, "we did what neighbors do, and the town stayed standing. I didn't need a record to tell me that, but a record shouldn't erase it either, and now it won't." He paused, letting the simple sentence fit in every ear the way a nail seats flush and clean wood. He spoke no heroics, only lines straight as plumb. Warnings cut in time, vans moved, wires made safe. He named others first Ray's truck, a farm crew, the boys from the elevator giving credit the shape of community. Then he turned to the present, to sump pumps checked, training kept current, sandbags ready for the low spot. "Remember forward," he said, as if pointing down Main toward the river bend and the school beyond. "Tell it right so the next right thing is easier to recognize when it shows up wet and loud." Pastor Elaine added nothing, but her hands folded and opened in a small liturgy of consent. The children watched her and mirrored the motion without understanding and with perfect accuracy. Ray cleared his throat and did not speak, because sometimes agreement is best made of posture alone. Whitaker's jaw eased, the last knot of rank relaxing into neighbor and witness and friend. Kyle touched the brim of an invisible cap, a reflex blooming where vanity used to stand. Hank's gaze drifted to the doorway and back, as if measuring the distance from weather to warmth. He did not raise his voice for what mattered. He lowered it so people had to come closer inside themselves. Honor lives where work is done and people are protected, he said. Not where paperwork sleeps. It costs something, and it keeps costing, but it pays better than any parade ever could. He let the meaning land like steady rain, each drop making the soil truer beneath their feet. A woman near the back whispered, "Thank you," and the room agreed by breathing in one long, whole breath. The new photograph on the corkboard caught the light, and the old flood picture rested flat beside it. Someone set a cup of fresh coffee by Hank's elbow, and he smiled at the kindness without ceremony. No applause rose, because applause would have been smaller than what the night deserved. What rose instead was resolve, quiet and useful, like daylight arriving early to a working town. Hank looked at Kyle and the line of young men behind him, and then at the elders lined like fence posts. "Storms don't ask for permission," he said. "They ask for preparation, and for a community that stands together. Do right before anyone writes it down, and you won't worry who gets named. Teach the kids why the generator matters and where the high ground starts. Make truth a habit you practice in small rooms so it holds when the river talks loud." He turned his head slightly, eyes on the flag that had watched them learn their better selves tonight. What he said next was not loud, but it was bright enough to carry to the corners and stay there. "Tell them who I chose to be," Hank murmured, the line gentle as a hand on a tired shoulder. Not a boast, not a plea in instruction, a compass bearing, a way to keep the map honest. The room held still, as if engraving the words into its studs and joists for the next hard season. Pastor Elaine dismissed no one. She only nodded, and the town understood dismissal as deployment. Chairs eased from stacks with quiet feet, and conversations began in the low, practical register of service. Whitaker lifted his hat, not to leave, but to carry the record where records live and make it stand. Ray laughed once soft and real, then started a list of phone calls that would become sand and fuel and drills. Kyle rolled up the floor mat, squared the edges twice, and asked where the sandbags were kept. As folks filtered toward the doors, the night met them like a neighbor with a porch light on. The rain had thinned to a clean mist, the kind that leaves everything sharper instead of smeared. Prairie Ridge breathed out and in, a town sized correctly again to its truth and its duty. No headlines waited outside, only roads, roofs, and a river that would someday test its banks again. When it did, they would be ready not for glory, but for one another, and that was the point all along.